All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining panOpen's Teaching in a Crisis webinar series. I'm Sonia Visser, Regional Sales Manager for panOpen. panOpen is designed by educators and is a courseware platform that realizes the promise of OER by providing all the components required for its widespread use. panOpen offers complete peer-reviewed content, customization tools, assessments, analytics, LMS integration, and a means of financially sustaining campus-based OER efforts. The turn toward remote digital learning is occurring as institutional and student budgets are severely strained, and panOpen can bridge the gap. We would love to provide a more detailed demo to help you customize your content. Our contact information will be listed at the end so that you can reach out to us. We've had the pleasure of working with John and Andy in the past on a Texas government project with edits to be released this summer, and they're going to discuss further customizations to their curriculum today. As you're preparing to teach government, sociology, psychology, or any introductory class this fall, you may be asking yourself, what are the best tools, techniques, and educational resources for remote learning? How can or should you incorporate into your curriculum elements pertaining to a crisis that is simultaneously about health and society, a virus, and racism? The goal of our discipline-specific summer webinar series is to address these precisely these questions. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few ground rules. We have disabled chat. However, you can post your questions in the Q&A section, and it's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We are going to be monitoring the Q&A section there for all the questions you submit. We're going to be stopping periodically throughout the presentation to offer those questions. We may not be able to get to all of them. However, we will be sending out the recording of this webinar, as well as all of these PowerPoint slides. So you can sit back and enjoy and don't feel you have to take notes because you'll have these slides at a later date. So let me introduce our experts. First, I'd like to welcome Andy Tees. He's a professor of government at Houston Community College. He holds a bachelor's degree from the Plan 2 Honors Program at the University of Texas and an MPA from the LBJ School of Public Affairs. His background includes work in the Texas Senate and the House of Representatives, the Congressional Liaison Office of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the Vice President of Public Affairs for the Houston Apartment Association. Thank you for joining us, Andy.
Thanks for having me.
I'd also like to welcome John Osterman. He's a full-time professor at San Jacinto College and an adjunct at Houston Community College. This will be his 20th year teaching full-time at San Jac. His undergraduate degree is from the University of Houston Downtown in Interdisciplinary Studies with an emphasis in political science. He graduated with a Master of Liberal Arts with an emphasis in poli-sci from the University of St. Thomas and has an ABD in political science at the University of Houston. He received several fellowships from the Earhart Foundation for Research into the Constitutional Convention of 1787. He's been teaching a senior level public opinion course at the UHD for nearly 20 years. He's also authored a text on American and Texas government called American and Texas Government Essentials. He was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, and served 15 years in the U.S. Air Force. He's married with 4 children, 2 of whom are in college. Thank you for joining us, John.
Thank you.
So we're going to start right now into the deep dive of the topics that John and Andy are going to discuss. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. By way of introducing the topic, John and I were talking about teaching government at a time like this. How do you teach government or political science at a time like this? Nothing works the way it's supposed to. Congress doesn't work the way it's supposed to. The executive branch doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to. It's a time when the things in the textbooks that we use don't seem to really apply. So how on earth do you work around that? And it reminded me of a scene in one of my favorite movies, Crimson Tide. If you've never seen it, it's Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington. And there's this great scene early in the movie where a fire breaks out in the galley, which a fire in a submarine is an amazingly terrifying thing to behold. But as they're extinguishing it, the captain calls for a nuclear missile drill, which is really inopportune time for this. And there's a lot of coughing and sputtering, and they go through part of it. But later in a debriefing, he's talking to his executive officer who says, and asks his executive officer, do you think I was wrong to run the drill? And the XO hedges a little and says, not necessarily. And the captain says, would you have run that drill? And he says, no, I wouldn't have. There was a fire. It could have flared back up. I would have seen to it first. The captain says, I'm sure you would have. On the other hand, I think that's the perfect time to run a missile drill. Lest you forget, this is a ship of war designed for battle. We don't always fight battles when everything is hunky-dory. And it sort of made me think about what we're discussing today. Government is designed for crisis. And if it's not correctly designed for crisis, it needs to be designed for crisis. So this is our finest hour. This is when we can show how government works when everything's not hunky-dory, when there are race riots, when there's a pandemic, when the Supreme Court is changing definitions and laws. This is the best time to teach government because it provides us all kinds of wonderful things that we can talk about. So with that introduction, let me turn it over to John to talk a little bit about the first of the topics that we're going to explore, that being federalism.
Thank you, Andy. I hope everybody can hear me fine. I'm glad he shared that introduction. I just wanted to add one more analogy that I was thinking about this morning. I don't know if everybody's familiar with football, but this topic of federalism kind of reminded me of a football game in the sense that what we've been watching is the coach calls a play, and then everybody on the field seems to decide for themselves what kind of play they're going to follow. It seems like it's been pure chaos. So analogies, I think, help us understand the topics that we're teaching. So since I know this is an interdisciplinary audience, or at least I've been told it is, I thought it'd be good to start with a definition. I apologize to the political scientists in the room. You already know the definition of federalism, but for those that aren't familiar, it's a relationship between the federal and the state government. And I think it's important to start with that because one of the things that I think my students struggle with the most, as a matter of fact, I'd say probably most people are unaware of the fact that we do have a federal system. They fail to recognize the fact that there are multiple levels of government at work. And so what defines that relationship is power. And the national government clearly has powers that the states do not have. For example, defense and regulating commerce. And the states are largely responsible for taking care of the social welfare of the residents of the state and police protection. And of course, we've all been dealing with local government, counties, cities, and school districts and their various policies. So I think it's important for us to remind our students, whether you're teaching government or not, that we don't have one government, that we have many governments, and each one is responsible for something different. And if we don't take that into account, it's going to be difficult to hold those governments accountable. So for example, the question is, how does this change during the public health crisis? Well, as Andy pointed out, it seems like everything is in chaos, and there's certainly a crisis. Some levels of government don't know what they're responsible for. Sometimes I think that's the case. And some are not willing to assume their responsibilities. So for example, what's the proper role of the federal government? We've seen since the outbreak, the government's imposed travel restrictions. Again, using my football analogy, there's been this kind of Monday morning quarterback approach. Everybody looks back on what's happened in the past and says, well, if they had done this, and if they had done this, and, if this person had acted in that way, we wouldn't be in this situation. But the reality is, I don't think there was ever a well-established playbook to begin with, much like September 11th or the Hurricane Katrina situation. this is unprecedented, even in Houston with Hurricane Harvey. So I'm not defending the government. I just think that we need to recognize the fact that the federal government has a role, and it's not the sole responsibility for how to respond to a crisis. One of the things that we've seen a problem with is putting out the PPE, the protective gear, right here in the Houston area as of this morning. Big news announcement that the state government is going to be providing school districts with PPE equipment. That was unheard of 4 months ago. The funding of WHO, some of you that follow the news know there's been a great debate about our contribution to the World Health Organization. And that's a huge responsibility of the federal government to help fund that organization. We're largely the one that carries the WHO. And then again, locally, if you're in the Houston area, we've had an increase in the number of cases. And part of that has been due to the availability of test kits. So that's just kind of an overview of the role of the federal government. And when we're teaching our students, are we talking to people about this crisis, I think we should keep that in mind. One other quick thing is the role of the state governments. Again, what is their responsibility to local government, providing funds, providing testing, and then of course we're all familiar with the requirements to wear a mask. So I'm kind of running short on time, but I just think that it's good for all of us to remind our students that we're dealing with multiple governments, multiple ways of accountability. And lately we've had some regional interstate coordination where states have decided not to pay attention to the federal government so much and decide to work together on their own. Andy, would you like to add on to that, or go ahead and talk about your topic of civil rights, which is probably even more important than what I'm talking about?
Well, everything starts with federalism, and all of the other things I think have their roots in that. But let's move on to civil liberties and civil rights in the interest of time. And what an amazing time to talk about civil liberties and civil rights. When we teach about the rights of the accused, we're normally talking about things that happen in courtrooms, with the exception of your Miranda rights when you're arrested. It's mostly a court procedure kind of a discussion. But now, what are the rights of the accused generally when confronted by police officers? When are police officers allowed under our constitutional system to exercise force, and what kind of force, and when does it become excessive? These are all things that we can use this crisis to sort of explore. Are there special rights for protesters? We have this long tradition of civil disobedience in this country, and we have the right to free speech both individually and collectively. The right to peaceably assemble and to petition our government for a redress of grievances. Where does that line fall when people are protesting? And protests always start out, not always, but often start out peacefully. Sometimes they don't end up that way. Many district attorneys are looking the other way right now when it comes to prosecuting people who did cross the line, allegedly, into looting stores and setting things on fire and breaking things. How do we fit that into our First Amendment system? Bostock versus Clayton County, a blockbuster civil rights case that had to do with the LGBT community, is another amazing teachable moment for us, and there are multiple ways to go at this. One being the public policy impact of recognizing LGBT individuals with civil rights on the same level as other oppressed groups. Also, it's a way to look at the court process and the separation of powers. What powers should the Supreme Court have to stretch the definition or the definitions in the Civil Rights Act the way they arguably did in the Bostock case? What about our civil rights with respect to things like social distancing and PPE requirements? What's a business owner's right to operate during a pandemic? And what emergency powers do governments have, or should governments have, to sort of get in the way of our normal business operations? Early in the pandemic, we had to make some decisions at the county level, mostly where I teach, on what constitutes an essential business. And there were some arguments about what kinds of stores are essential and maybe which ones aren't. We did very quickly and decisively decide that liquor stores in Texas are essential. So with that, we sort of proceeded through the smaller stuff. And then finally, churches. What about our right to worship? And then how is that impacted by a pandemic when we need to keep people from interacting in a way that they can infect each other? What about liability? Do the owners of property, the owners of businesses, become liable civilly if someone contracts the disease at their place of business? So there's so many questions and there's so many opportunities for us to explore that get outside of the box of government as usual. So John, you want to weigh in on any of that?
I think Sonia said that we're going to see if there are any questions before we move on.
That's right, we have a question break now.
We actually do have one question, an anonymous question. How do you best address a civil rights discussion and stay as non-opinionated as possible? As you all are thinking about going back to your courses and going back to the fall and having this in your course, how do you handle that discussion?
Can you repeat the question one more time, Sonia?
So the question is, how do you best address a civil rights discussion and stay as non-opinionated as possible?
I'll start if you want. Yeah. First of all, I don't know that you can. I always try very hard to not interject my personal opinions if I can avoid it. It's more difficult when you get into issues like this. But I think the best that you can do is to just sort of play devil's advocate with your students a little bit. Try to present different sides of the argument in a credible way, and don't tip your hand too much about what side you're on. And encourage your students, whether it's virtually in a Zoom class like we're doing a lot of these days, or if we ever get back to the classroom, let them give their side of it, and encourage people to respectfully disagree.
Great.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Andy said, and I think the thing that gets many people in trouble is they try and bring about some kind of humor or levity to these things, and that's probably not the best approach. To take a purely academic approach to it and say, as Andy said, here's this side, here's that side, here's what we've seen in the past. But it is difficult, and it's often good to hear from their students first, to kind of find out, where their sensibilities are. Andy and I both teach at HCC, Houston area. We have a very diverse audience, all different, variations of people. And so it is a difficult task, but I think that if we're professional and we're honest and we keep to the facts, we'll be fine. That's
Great. Thank you, John. I just want to remind all attendees that if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A section at the very bottom of the Zoom. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about public opinion right now, and asking academics to talk for a very short period of time about any of these topics is nearly impossible because there's so much that we could say, but I'll just try and hit some of the highlights. With regard to public opinion, as Sonia said, I've taught it for many years. And one of the things that we have to recognize, and again, this is an interdisciplinary kind of approach, whether you teach sociology or psychology, all of your students and all of us are getting our information from the media. I think very few of us have firsthand knowledge of many of the things that we're, experiencing. So just be mindful the fact that the media has a motivation, right? It's to produce the largest possible audience. And that's perfectly all right. This is capitalism. They're allowed to make money. But the thing is, they tend to probably put too much emphasis on things and leave other things left behind. So I think making your students aware of the fact that what we see in the media is not necessarily what's happening everywhere, or it's not happening the way it's portrayed. So public opinion, again, is a reflection of media. So if the media starts talking about the number of coronavirus cases going up, and then you do a poll and you ask people, hey, what do you think's going on? They're going to say, oh, coronavirus cases are going up, whether it's true or not. And the reason why that's important is because public opinion polls are really reflecting just what the media is telling us. So the media has an ability to shape opinion. And then one of the things I've discovered lately, which I probably should have known all along, is that our students, and I say our students, it's not really fair because some of our students aren't young, but a lot of them are young, and they depend heavily on social media. And so what they get from Twitter or Facebook or other websites is not necessarily, the way it is. And, they tend to believe that it is, right? Trust in media, we know, has been low for a very long time. And there's good reason to believe that we shouldn't trust the media because we keep hearing stories about, falsely reported things. So, again, an awareness that our students are coming to our classes with information that might not be accurate. And to be honest, who's to say what is accurate? We're all relying on more or less the same sources for information. And then corporations, the government, higher education, they're all trying to shape public opinion as well. I know Andy's going to, I think, talk about this later, but public corporations with branding, changing the name of brand items, colleges and universities changing names. It's an effort to shape public opinion. So the last thing I'll just leave you with is the fact that we know that young people economically have been hit the hardest by this pandemic. And so their emphasis is on what can the government do to solve my economic problems. Older Americans, polls show, are more concerned about the health aspect. So obviously they're more concerned about what can the government do to protect my health. And without question, right, we know that we live in a very partisan world. And it's fascinating to see polls that show that Republicans are much more optimistic about the future. They tend to trust the national government less and trust local governments more. And the Democrats tend to want to have the national government solve more of the problems. And they believe that the local governments are doing a much better job. So there's a real dichotomy in terms of approaches. So to conclude with that question from Anonymous, right? You have students in your class that might have different religious beliefs, race, ethnicity, but also very different political views. And they're going to interpret what you say in part based on, how they see themselves and how they see you as a political actor.
John, we had a question come through just on, if social media is not reliable and neither is some of the mainstream, where do you get your information? And Andy can answer that too.
Yeah, that's a question I often get from students, and the difficulty is what I said before, is that nobody has an exclusive access to information that I know of, right? So that's where critical thinking comes in. When you see something posted online, your first thought should be, is it possible that that's wrong? Is it possible that that's not accurate? Maybe look at other sources, so we always hear Republicans are more likely to watch Fox and Democrats are more likely to watch CNN. If the source that you most often use doesn't seem to be making sense to you, or even if it does, check another source. But I don't think there is any one source that we can all say with confidence, this is always going to be true. This is always going to be right. And not to belabor the point, but that's not just true of the media, but it's also true of our institutions, right? Whether they're government, school, businesses, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and that contributes to the chaos. It really does.
I think
Andy, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, just one thing. I think that, more so than, how a bill becomes a law and all of that, probably the most important thing that we can teach our students right now is how to be a responsible, intelligent, critical consumer of information. I don't think it's ever our place to say, believe CNN, ignore Fox, or believe Fox and ignore CNN. But I think we can help give our students the tools to, look for, objective, tested truth, which is a difficult thing. I mean, you could spend your whole course on it, but that's something I think we need to go back to again and again and again, help students consume news responsibly and critically.
I'm going to add one more little question onto that came up. Adding to this, is there, do either of you, do you all utilize a minimally biased perspective? Is there a particular, to continue this idea, are there any resources in particular that either of you utilize that provide a minimally biased perspective?
Oh, wow. Go ahead, John.
Yeah. Well, being an academic, in the assignments that I give my students, I always ask them to use peer-reviewed journal articles. It doesn't mean it's without bias completely, but the fact that, there are academic journals that are peer-reviewed, I think kind of goes a long way into ensuring that what we're getting is, more accurate than what you would get on the, evening newscast.
And I guess with me, it's not so much, finding a balanced source. It's about looking at different sources to try to find your own balance. If you read the editorial page in the New York Times, you really should read the editorial page in the Wall Street Journal too. And then, use that to kind of ferret out, the truth.
Great, thank you. And just, I want to add a point here. We had also come up that, you can utilize your librarians as tools to help with teaching students about reliable news and information sources, et cetera, as well, so.
So that brings us to local government, one of my favorite things to teach. And this has been a fascinating time to look at local government on so many levels. So let's start basically with the pandemic. In Texas, the county judge of a county, by definition, is the emergency manager for that county. Whereas we always teach about how counties generally have fewer powers than cities. Counties don't have ordinance making authority. Counties actually have fairly extraordinary powers in the time of a disaster. And so this is an amazing time to kind of operationalize that and show how that really works. Just really quickly, in this crisis, you had the county judge issue an order, which was superseded the very next day by an order from the governor. And so our local county judge here in Harris County, which is where Houston is, has had to try to tread this very careful line to do all that she feels like she needs to do, but not step over the line where Governor Abbott, Greg Abbott, who's the governor of Texas, is going to supersede what she's doing. Meanwhile, the city mayor in Houston, has extraordinary power with respect to other city mayors. Houston has what we call a strong mayor system, and a particularly strong variant of the strong mayor system because he has unilateral control over the city council agenda. He has had all kinds of pressure from sources with respect to the pandemic, with respect to racial issues and the police, and watching him deal with that has been kind of a teachable moment too. Mentioned on the PowerPoint slide, varying policy positions from colleges and universities, which of course in the case of a community college district, we are in fact a local government. How do we fulfill our mission to teach students at a time where it's very difficult to have face-to-face classes? What does that do to our core mission of trying to teach people who may not have the resources or the wherewithal to be going to Baylor or Rice? There's a digital divide that we have to deal with when we're talking about taking our entire curriculum online. So another local government issue that we can deal with. With respect to the George Floyd murder and all of what that set off, what is the responsibility for law and order during protests. What exactly is the best role of the police department or the sheriff's office at a time like that? We keep hearing about, defunding the police. We should defund the police. Well, what exactly does that mean? And how do you maintain, public safety, which is, one of the key core functions that the local city government, county government does? How do you square that with calls to change fundamentally the way that police departments and other law enforcement entities do their job? How do you do oversight properly for a police department? Every police department, every sheriff's office has some sort of a review board, but what sort of powers do they have, and who makes up those entities? So a lot of ground to cover in these. And then under public education, how are students learning? How are they being assessed? What is the new school year next year going to even look like? The state government in Texas, well, the governor came out and said very decisively, schools are going to open as scheduled, nothing's going to change. Well, as I was discussing with some other parent friends of mine, an elementary school classroom is pretty much a petri dish anyway. During the best of times, when there's a pandemic afoot, a class full of second graders putting everything you can imagine in their mouth, I can't see how that ends well. On the other hand, how do you put a second grader in front of a computer and do remote education? I mean, there's things you can do, but there's a lot of really difficult questions that local governments, school districts are going to have to face. How do you protect students in schools? How do you protect the teachers and the staff? How do you make technology available, and not just the technological hardware, but the internet infrastructure, the Wi-Fi infrastructure to support that? And where do you come up with the money for it? Many, many questions that we have as we address local government. John?
I think, Sonia, there was a break for any questions. Do you have any recent questions?
We have one, and it actually popped in a little bit earlier, but what are your thoughts on addressing microaggressions?
Wow. Well, the difficulty with that is that, first of all, you have to recognize that they exist, right? So, somebody that's putting forth images or language or behavior that is, seen as offensive or harmful or damaging to others, they may not be aware of it. And so it makes for a difficult conversation to somehow inform that person. I just saw a recent story out of, I think it was California, of a community college professor that was let go because they had some difficulty dealing with a student that had a name that was not particularly easy to pronounce. And, they were, adamant about, how they would use this student's name. And it led to that person's being at least temporarily suspended, a lot of hurt feelings, puts the community college in jeopardy. So it's a difficult conversation to have, but it's a conversation that we need to have probably more often. It's being aware of what is offensive to people or what is hurtful to people. We can't often see ourselves. We can on these Zoom calls, right? We see our image, but we don't see what we project to others. And so being mindful of the fact that everybody doesn't see us the way we are would probably go a long way to help us, communicate with students better, especially right now. Like I said, young people in particular are hurt more, according to polls, by this pandemic. Recent story today, the minority community is hurt more. They're more likely to get the virus. So, being mindful of where these folks are coming from, our students, whether it be poor or their race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation. It takes a big responsibility for us to, identify more with people's concerns.
Well, the only thing I would add
Andy,
is
you want to add on to that?
I just wanted to add, we have to be cautious on both sides of this. And what I mean by that is you certainly don't want to offend people if you can avoid it. We certainly don't want to commit microaggressions if we can avoid it. On the other hand, to explore these topics involves having some difficult conversations. And I think as great a threat as it is that, you know, someone might be offended by something that you say, I think maybe the greater threat is professors will be so overly cautious that something they say might somehow offend somebody that they just steer away from controversy. And I think that's probably the biggest microaggression of all, because to really explore these topics involves discussing some uncomfortable things and airing some opinions that you may very much disagree with. So I think we owe it to our students to, while being as sensitive as we can, not to shy away from controversy, not to shy away from controversy and uncomfortable topics.
Great, thank you, Andy. I'm going to go back to one question that's related to this, what we have on the screen, which is, the current situation we have, do you think it will divide students further from an access standpoint? And, I look at that, thinking about, your institutions and how you all will also deal with students, whether they have, access to digital tools and how you all will handle that situation.
I can start.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Andy.
I just say, if we're not careful, I think absolutely this could divide us further. There are students who, and I found this with my students, back in March. There are students who made the transition from in-class to online like that. It was completely seamless, and there are other people that were just lost beyond recognition. And we have to recognize, the students that we teach in a community college situation, it is a wide range of students from, with respect to income, with respect to, access to educational tools, academic preparedness, all of that. So, with a mission as broad as ours, I think we have to be very, very careful that we do everything we can to accommodate students who are not really prepared to make this transition very well.
And just, can you hear me?
Yes, John.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I agree with what Annie says. Yes, I think it's going to continue to be a problem. And I'll give you a couple of really quick examples. One is that, a lot of the students that I think we have often are still at home. And even if they're not at home, they're unemployed. Millions upon millions of Americans are unemployed. And that means, you lose the internet, you lose your cell phone service, right? You lose access to those technologies. And then, their work schedule is going to have to radically change to, with their financial demands. So, they might have started the semester planning on being on a class Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but by halfway through the semester, they're working different jobs, different hours. So there's a multitude of things that are contributing to this divide, and I don't see any of it necessarily getting better. Some schools are offering free tuition, they're offering computers and technology, but there are going to be a lot of folks out there that are just not going to get the education they once had because of this situation. For sure.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, John.
Do you want me to move on to Congress, or did you have another question?
Yes, I was just going to say, anybody that has any questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen.
All right. So just a couple of things about Congress. Congress is one of those institutions that people tend to trust the least. And, I'm not one to necessarily promote Congress, but I will say that if for good or bad, since March, Congress has passed legislation, and they've spent, I think I came up with about $3 trillion. So, if you think about the CARES Act and the fact that many Americans received some kind of financial stimulus, that's good. Unfortunately, not everybody receive stimulus. Some people probably shouldn't have gotten any. As of today, there's talk of the HEROES Act passing maybe by the end of the month. It's already passed in the House, so that's even more stimulus money. And the question that, as political scientists, I think we ask is, who's getting the money? Who's benefiting from the money? Where is the money coming from? How are we going to pay for this? We've had a tradition of this in the past, so it's not completely unheard of. It's just that the dollar figures seem to go up and up and up. And one of the things here I have is about the national debt. At a time of crisis, most people aren't concerned about the debt, but having a national debt of $26 trillion and an annual deficit of nearly $3 trillion means that debt has to be serviced. And so, going forward, Congress is going to have to make decisions about spending, being mindful of servicing that debt. And, community colleges all across the country, depend heavily on federal financial aid, to fund their students' education. So these are things that we should probably be talking to our students about, the role of Congress, making sure they know who their member of Congress is, how do they vote on these types of measures, what are the plans going forward. I think the president tends to get probably, more media attention than he deserves, while Congress is behind the scenes, involving themselves in a lot of how this pandemic is being dealt with. Andy, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you covered it. It's a challenging time to study Congress.
One question that came through is about the election, and we're in a very big election year, and knowing what happened 4 years ago, thinking about just the election itself and mail-in ballots, and how will you approach this topic within your courses?
Andy?
Sure, I'll start out. First of all, I love teaching government while an election is going on, because students probably hate having me while an election is going on, because I put all kinds of stuff on them. My students will become the virtual campaign manager for some candidate for local office, and I will make them design a campaign to win an election for state representative or justice of the peace or something like that. Meanwhile, I will, go over with great glee, everything that's happened since we last met. Every time we have a class, I end up with way too many PowerPoint slides with polls and stuff like that. So I'm a kid in a candy store teaching government while there's an election going on. I probably didn't answer the question, did I?
No, I think that's perfect. Are you going to change, will anything change, just knowing that, we right now in the primary, there's mail-in ballots? Are there any other, topics that you will be addressing or change what you might have done, based on that?
Well, it changes every time. I guess, I always want to tailor it to the election that's currently going on. I will, throw voter registration applications at all my students, over and over again until the deadline hits. Try to get them to consider participating. One of the things that I always try to do in a presidential election year is to help students realize that the presidential election is only one election. It's what sucks all the oxygen out of the media room. But, especially in a long ballot state like Texas, once you get past voting for whoever you're going to vote for president, there's 100 other races on the ballot, all of which are important. In your day-to-day life, whether it's a judge who may, rule on your case in civil court or criminal court, or a justice of the peace that may be, deciding whether it's a traffic ticket or whether or not you get evicted from your apartment, to, state reps and senators and county commissioners and everybody else. It's all critically important. So I try to overemphasize local elections, I guess, in a presidential year, because I feel like nobody else does.
Great.
The only thing I would really add to that is kind of what I alluded to earlier. We're in a very hyper-partisan environment right now, and I think that elections, bring that out even more. And we probably don't have time in a venue like this to discuss it, but a lot of the things that you hear coming from politicians or, corporations or, the media, is biased, it is motivated, for political reasons. And that's most unfortunate because I think the public suffers the most when politicians, are being partisan in their behavior, to administer the government. So, yeah, I think we're going to, I mean, like Andy said, if you're a political scientist, this is like the Super Bowl, right? I mean, this is prime time for us. We enjoy this, but I think it's very distressing for a lot of students. We recently saw the decision of the Supreme Court on DACA. A lot of my students are, they worry about, what will the courts decide about their future? So elections that they say have consequences. And so this is going to be a challenging time. And I think we need to recognize that, again, our students have, very real fears, real concerns at the federal, state, and local level, for sure.
Thank you.
Our last kind of deep dive topic was sort of our catch-all that we thought we'd put at the end for anything that didn't fit into the others, public policy. And there's a lot that we could do here. We could do another hour on this, but just a few things that we thought we should mention. Dealing with systemic racism in general, which is something that I really have not done in my class much, trying to get through the basics of government, but it's something that we really need to and there's a lot of ways that we could go about this. I'm always uncomfortable as a middle-aged white guy, pontificating on this a lot, but that's no excuse for not getting into it. So it's something that we need to be aware of and something that we need to work into the curriculum for our courses. From the general to the specific, policies like for police, body cameras, training, recruitment screening. Who do we hire? What tools do we give them? What kind of training do we give them? And what essentially is their job? And is it different or should it be different from how it was 2 months ago? Something that I think we need to discuss. Preparing for the next pandemic. I may spend a whole unit on this this fall because it's something to think about. COVID-19, the death rate from COVID-19, depending on how you measure it, is somewhere around 1.3%. It's a little bit worse than the flu. And yet we've had 123,000 deaths so far. What if we had a pandemic that was more fatal? What if there was something that was as infectious as COVID-19, but with a fatality rate that was 10% or 20% or 30%? What if it was something like AIDS, but that was contagious, the way COVID-19 is? We are not in any way equipped to deal with something like that. How can we be? Do we need to stockpile personal protective equipment? Is that even really relevant? Would it make any difference? We don't really know because we don't know what the next pandemic is going to be, but we obviously need to do more to prepare. And if anything, maybe the silver lining in the cloud of COVID-19 is it will be a wake-up call that we need to recognize the threat of pandemics, as something that we need to prepare for better. What sort of best practices for law enforcement and criminal justice? What do we do about keeping our society safe while also avoiding mass incarceration is a policy that we can see has not really worked very well, and with all kinds of disparities in the way that it's applied. And then finally, as social scientists, what role should we play in things like determining how society should police themselves? What tools can we bring to bear on this, aside from just teaching students through our research? So, John? John, I think you're still muted.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Oh, I was just going to see if you wanted to weigh in. I kind of blew through that because I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, no, I think you did a great job. I guess to kind of wrap all of this up is that our student, it's cliche, right? Our students are the future, right? And policies are designed to produce particular outcomes. And they're going to be the ones making the decisions in the future about, how the government behaves, right? So I think it's very important. It's a responsibility of ours to help them ask questions, again, critical thinking questions about, what are the best policies, and not just based on, oh, well, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, but based on social science. Have these things been tested? Do we know that body cameras make a difference? Do we know training makes a difference? What do we know about our world? And so that's the only thing that I would really add, is that to help our students most is to help them think better about how decisions are made with regard to policies that produce real outcomes, right? I mean, whether the death rate is 1% or 1.9% or 2%, people are dying, and they're dying as a result of something that perhaps could be, minimized. And so, again, just policy is about making good decisions. And if we can help them make better decisions, I think we've done a pretty good job.
Great. Thank you, John. So we've got one feature question at the end here. Do you see these teaching in a crisis ideas you discussed today as being a one-off for the fall term, or do you see your teaching style becoming more flexible in the future based on the lessons learned from the last several months?
Well, I'll jump in there real quick. I don't see it as a one-off. The mantra for everything we've experienced over the past 3 months is you've got to be flexible. And what's interesting to me about this, as I've said before, we've dealt with natural disasters before. We've dealt with, various types of pandemics before. Andy mentioned AIDS. I remember, in the 80s, how that dominated the news. So for those of us that are older, we've seen a lot of these themes before. All these things aren't necessarily new. They're maybe on a grander scale. So we're going to have to continue to be flexible in how we get information, how we communicate the information, how we're receptive to the challenges that our students face. I've had several students, write back to me over this past couple of months and say, "Oh, I'm so glad you reached out because, I was overwhelmed with work and school and, sickness and family members." And so we're kind of having to be a counselor of sorts. So yeah, I don't see this as a one-off at all. We'll definitely have to continue to be flexible.
Great. Thank you, John. Andy?
I would have to agree. I mean, if there's anything we've learned from 2020, it's that it's always a crisis. And whenever one crisis ebbs a little bit, another one seems to take its place. So like John said, I think we need to be more flexible than ever before. We need to tailor our courses constantly to fit the reality of the environment in which we're teaching.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us today and for all of the information that you've provided, wealth of knowledge, and we really appreciate that. Your contact information is on the screen. And as I mentioned, we're going to be sending this recording out to all the attendees, as well as the PowerPoint slides, so everyone will have access to that. And from panOpen, we also want to thank you. We are going to be having this webinar series throughout the summer, so we'll be sending out more invitations. And again, as I mentioned earlier, these are discipline specific, but we do open them up to interdisciplinary faculty, as you can learn from each other, and there could be ideas that you'd like to incorporate into your coursework as well. So feel free, contact us. We would love to share our platform with you and provide a demo. We hope you all have a very safe and wonderful afternoon. Thank you, Andy and John, and thank you all for attending.